Max Jarrett had never imagined he'd still be working with his hands at nearly 60, but then again, he never really imagined doing anything else. For the past 3 decades, his life had revolved around one simple thing: his garage. Tucked behind his modest ranch-style home on a half-acre of land just outside a sleepy suburb, the garage wasn't just a workspace. It was a shrine to the mechanical world, a place that smelled of oil, rubber, steel, and purpose. The heavy scent of grease hung in the air like incense in a cathedral. He built it himself, brick by brick, back when people still borrowed tools from neighbors and used tape measures more than phones. It stood as a symbol of what it meant to be self-made. No loans, no gimmicks, just work. Inside, the space was dim but organized, lit by long overhead fluorescents that flickered stubbornly in winter. An array of tools hung from the walls, each in its proper place polished by decades of use rather than vanity. An old coffee maker, stained from years of overuse, sat on a metal workbench next to a beat-up transistor radio that only played local stations when the dial was nudged just right. The garage had character, it had scars, but most of all, it had soul. Max's days started early. Real early. While the rest of the neighborhood was still quiet and the air was crisp and blue with morning haze, he'd unlock the side door, flip on the breakers, and let the familiar hum of electrical life fill the space. Engines weren't just machines to him. They were puzzles, stories, characters. Each carburetor told him how the owner treated their ride. Each belt, bolt, and misfire whispered clues only he seemed able to interpret. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. And in Max's world, honesty was currency. He wasn't a talker. His face, deeply lined and weathered from years under hoods and welding masks, often gave people the impression that he was angry, when really he was just tired of nonsense. He didn't chase trends. He didn't have social media. He didn't care about what cars were doing in Tokyo or how kids were tuning their exhausts to sound like machine guns. Max focused on keeping things running, and in return, people brought their machines to him from neighboring counties. Word of mouth had built his reputation like a stone wall, slow, heavy, and unshakable. He'd fixed the sheriff's truck, the mayor's Harley, and even once rebuilt a classic '68 Mustang for a kid who paid in monthly installments over 2 years. The town had changed over the years. Where there used to be cornfields and gravel roads, now there were paved lanes, artificial ponds, and fast-built homes with nearly identical porches. The older generation had either sold out or passed on, and a new wave of homeowners brought in by real estate brochures promising community living began to reshape the atmosphere. Max watched it all unfold with a quiet contempt. He knew what was coming. He could smell it before he saw it. It started with the signs. Community Cleanup Day, Friendly Friday Night Fire Pit, Pet Waste Ordinance. Harmless enough at first. Then came the complaints. One morning, as he leaned over the hood of a rebuilt Yamaha with the kind of carb trouble that could keep a man up at night, a stranger walked up his drive. Clean shirt, slacks too, pressed for a weekday, clipboard in hand. Max didn't even look up. The man cleared his throat once, then again, more insistent. Max sighed and wiped his hands with a rag before finally acknowledging him. "Max Jarrett?" the man asked. Max nodded. "I'm with the Neighborhood Association. We've received some concerns about your garage." The words concerns and garage floated there in the air like flies waiting to land. Max stared at him, unimpressed. What kind of concerns? "Well, a few residents have mentioned noise levels during non-business hours, and there's some confusion about whether this qualifies as a commercial operation within a residential zone." Max let the silence sit heavy between them. Finally, he replied, "I've been here longer than those houses. I built this garage before you built your bylaws." The man smiled thinly, not as someone who's won an argument, but as someone who doesn't care about losing one. He handed Max a letter. "You can submit your records for review. Until then, we ask that all mechanical activity cease during evenings and weekends." That night, Max didn't sleep. He sat on the bench behind his garage, a cigarette burning slowly between his fingers, watching the stars shift behind the faint glow of suburban street lamps. He wasn't scared. He'd fought tougher fights, but he knew what this was. It wasn't about noise. It wasn't about zoning. It was about control. About a group of people who didn't like that his yard didn't match theirs, that his fence was old wood instead of PVC, that he listened to Springsteen at 6 a.m., and didn't wave back when they waved first. He was inconvenient, unbranded, unpolished, and they wanted him gone. By the end of the week, there were 4 more letters in his mailbox. One cited improper storage of mechanical parts visible from the street. Another claimed multiple non-operational vehicles, and a third informed him that his gravel driveway violated uniform surface aesthetics. The fourth was the kicker, a fine. Not a warning, a fine, for unauthorized use of property inconsistent with community character. $50. Not much, but Max understood the move. It was bait. They wanted a reaction. They wanted him to push back, get angry, maybe get loud, so they could file a report, call a meeting, and start their slow march toward court. But Max didn't take the bait. Not yet. He did what he always did. He worked. He kept his mouth shut, collected every letter, scanned and printed every one. He organized them in a file marked nonsense. He took photos of his lot every day from multiple angles. He began checking the county zoning maps. He even made a quiet visit to City Hall and had a 15-minute conversation with the only clerk who remembered him from when he helped fix her husband's Dodge Ram 15 years ago. She promised to send him copies of the original zoning designations. No promises, no speeches, just quiet groundwork. What they didn't know was that Max wasn't a man who just turned wrenches. He'd served in the Navy in his 20s. Not that he talked about it, but it gave him something few people had: patience and precision. When he moved, it was with intent. When he acted, it was permanent. And while others flailed in meetings and fought over who would run the community bake sale, Max was planning. But all of that was just the beginning, because the people trying to push Max out had never dealt with someone like him. They thought they were fighting a noise complaint. They thought they were dealing with a guy who'd fold under paper and signatures and polite threats. What they didn't know, what they never considered, was that Max Jarrett didn't fight back the way they expected. And when the time came, he wasn't just going to protect his garage, he was going to make them regret they ever walked up his driveway in the first place. 2 weeks passed in an uncomfortable silence, the kind that fills the air not because nothing is happening, but because something is building beneath the surface. Max kept to his rhythm. He fixed what came in, turned away work when it didn't feel right, and watched from behind smudged garage windows as his street slowly shifted in tone. More new cars parked on driveways that had once held beat-up pickups. More strollers, more manicured hedges, more nods and forced smiles. The change wasn't sudden. It was creeping. And it was always watching. One Tuesday morning, a familiar low thrum of an old dirt bike echoed up the street. It was Dustin, the neighbor's kid. Max had helped the boy rebuild his Suzuki 2 summers ago after his dad gave up on it and told him to scrap it. Now, Dustin rode that thing like it was part of his soul. He waved, grinning, and Max waved back. That simple gesture was the last one he'd get without strings attached. Later that afternoon, after wiping the last of the oil from his hands and kicking back with a cup of bitter, burned coffee, Max spotted a group of unfamiliar faces pacing along the edge of his driveway. 3 of them, all wearing white shirts tucked into slacks, the kind of look that screamed sales pitch or lawsuit. One held a folder, another a notepad, and the third was pointing toward the garage with a laser measurer, scanning and jotting something as if cataloging a crime scene. Max didn't move at first. He just sat there in the garage doorway, coffee in one hand, rag in the other, and watched. When the man with the folder finally noticed him, he gave a forced mechanical wave and approached without waiting for an invitation. "Mr. Jarrett," he began, his voice coated in fake politeness. "I'm James Holloway. I represent the local Neighborhood Improvement Committee." He said it like it was something to be proud of, like the phrase should carry weight. Max didn't respond. James continued, unfazed by the silence. "We've received multiple formal complaints regarding your property's non-conforming use." That was the phrase that always came up in letters. Non-conforming. Max had grown to hate it more than any insult. It was bureaucracy's way of saying, "You don't belong here," but dressed up in paper and ink. James kept talking, explaining how a compliance review had determined that Max's garage, though standing on private land, fell under new visual standards adopted at the last community vote, one Max was never notified of. Apparently, his property was now part of an adjacent visual corridor meant to maintain aesthetic consistency for the area. Max raised an eyebrow at that one. "You're telling me my garage is breaking some rule because people can see it from the road?" James offered a tight smile. "It's more nuanced than that." It wasn't. They wanted it gone. The next day, Max found his mailbox stuffed. Not just a letter, but a full envelope, thick with documents. Inside were photos of his yard taken from the street, with red circles drawn around tires, tool racks, even a stack of scrap metal he'd planned to haul the following week. There were time-stamped entries, violation codes, fine amounts, and a formal notice. Within 15 business days, all unauthorized mechanical operations must cease, or the matter would be escalated to municipal code enforcement. He flipped through the pages slowly, letting each absurd claim settle in his chest like ash. One page mentioned a combustion-related health hazard, citing noise and smoke during repairs. Another called his fence visually incompatible. But the last one was what hit hardest. A temporary injunction had been filed with the town's property board to freeze any structural changes or expansions on his land, including repairs to the garage. Roof he had scheduled next month. He didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table surrounded by folders, photos, and letters, with the harsh overhead light buzzing above him like an angry hornet. Around 3 a.m., he cracked open his old file cabinet, the one he hadn't touched since the county tried to rezone his land 10 years ago. Inside were plats, maps, permits, correspondence with the original developer, and even a hand-signed letter from a long-retired city planner confirming that Max's garage, by all standing codes, was legal and grandfathered in long before the area became residential. He scanned everything, uploaded it to 3 separate USB drives, printed 2 sets of physical copies, and tucked the originals back into their plastic sleeves. By dawn, he had a binder thicker than most of the association's policy books. That morning, Max drove down to the city records office in a truck that hadn't passed emissions in 5 years, but still ran like thunder on 4 wheels. He waited in line for an hour, exchanged pleasantries with an overworked clerk who remembered him from a radiator job a few years back, and handed over the binder. "If they want a fight," he said plainly, "then I want everything you've got on property lines, code revisions, variances, and the committee that filed the injunction. Names, dates, and signatures." The clerk didn't argue. She just nodded and started printing. But Max wasn't done. He didn't trust luck, and he sure as hell didn't trust committees. He paid out of pocket to have a licensed surveyor revisit his land. When the guy showed up in his little white van and asked why the urgency, Max just said, "Because they're trying to erase history with Photoshop and bylaws, and I need real lines drawn with ink and iron." Within 48 hours, the survey confirmed what? Max already knew. Nothing had changed. His garage sat squarely within the boundaries. His access road was recorded. His structures were legal. So when the second envelope came, this time hand-delivered and signed by 3 members of the neighborhood council, Max didn't even flinch. They were requesting a meeting, in the interest of resolving matters amicably. They chose neutral ground, a shared lawn space near the clubhouse where folding chairs were already arranged in a neat semicircle when Max arrived. there were 5 of them waiting. Holloway, the clipboard guy, the HOA president's wife, a lawyer-looking man with a tan folder, and a young woman who avoided Max's eyes. Max didn't sit. He just stood with his arms crossed, binder under one arm. Holloway opened the discussion with a passive-aggressive smile. "Mr. Jarrett, we appreciate your time. We know you value your independence, and we respect that. However, the community's needs must be considered." Max didn't answer. He just stared. Another stepped in. "We've come to offer a proposal. We understand you've been here a long time, and we'd like to help make your transition easier." Max raised an eyebrow. "Transition?" The woman spoke, voice soft. "If you'd be willing to cease garage operations, we can offer a relocation stipend. $5,000 to assist with dismantling and cleanup." Max took a slow breath. 5,000 for 30 years of work. For a structure he built with his own hands that had outlasted most of the marriages in the neighborhood. He looked at each of them, their perfectly ironed collars, their scripted empathy. Then he opened the binder, pulled out a single page, the signed approval from the original city planner, and handed it to the lawyer-looking man. "I'm not interested in your bribe," he said, "but I want you to keep this. You'll need it when your committee tries to escalate this to court." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Behind him, someone muttered something about non-cooperative behavior. Another about legal consequences. Max didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He knew where this was going, and he wasn't going to wait around for them to set the terms. He had engines to tune, tools to sharpen, and, when the time came, a very loud, very deliberate message to send. It didn't take long for the next shot to be fired, though Max had already expected it. Within 5 days of the so-called amicable proposal meeting, a flatbed truck arrived early in the morning and dropped off a large pallet of prefabricated fencing panels right on the edge of Max's property, right where his gravel driveway met the shared road. No note, no explanation, just the sudden materialization of a barrier in waiting. The delivery guy barely made eye contact as Max walked out to meet him, only muttering that he was just doing what the order said, before speeding off down the street like he'd been caught trespassing. Max didn't move the panels. He just took out his phone, took 6 photos from different angles, sent them to his lawyer, and wrote down the license plate of the truck. He'd seen this kind of tactic before. Not directly, maybe, but in the way small men with small authority try to box in people who don't bend. This wasn't about regulation. It was a siege, slow and polite and stacked with paperwork, but a siege nonetheless. 2 days later, Dustin, the teenager from next door, came over just before sunset, looking rattled. His dirt bike had been parked in Max's driveway overnight, as it often was when Max was helping him with tuning or cleaning up a fuel issue, but now it lay tipped over against the curb. One mirror snapped clean off, and the left handlebar bent at a strange angle. Someone had pushed it over. Max didn't have to say anything. Dustin's clenched jaw and burning eyes said it all. He helped the kid stand the bike back up, checked the throttle cable and brakes to make sure it was still rideable, then told him to keep it in the back lot for now. "They won't touch it back there," he said, though the truth was he wasn't so sure anymore. That night, Max installed motion sensor lights across his front yard, mounted higher than regulation allowed. He ran them through a private battery backup, completely off-grid, and angled them to cover the front gate and driveway with overlapping cones of blinding white light. He also rigged a simple perimeter trip alarm, a trick he hadn't used since his younger years working security on remote construction sites, but one that still worked better than most fancy tech. It wasn't paranoia, it was protocol, because whatever was coming next wasn't going to be a letter. The escalation became clear 2 mornings later, when Max awoke to find a bright yellow notice stapled to his garage door. Not taped, stapled, like a warrant, like a bounty. He pulled it off and read through the stiff, laminated sheet. Emergency interim zoning violation, unauthorized operating facility. Cease all mechanical and vehicular activity until administrative review is completed. There was a case number, a printed seal from the local zoning board, and a warning that any non-compliance would result in daily penalties and legal enforcement. No official had come to speak with him. No one from the city had scheduled a site review. This wasn't city-initiated. It had been pushed through by the same people who brought folding chairs and smiles to that meeting in the park. Max sent the notice to his attorney immediately, who confirmed that while the seal was legitimate, the process to issue an interim order like this required either verified public complaints or safety violations, neither of which were recorded against Max's address. Later that afternoon, Max watched from inside the garage as a pair of HOA representatives, or whatever title they used to justify their presence, walked slowly along the curb with clipboards, stopping every 10 feet to write something down or take a picture. One of them crouched near the rear fence line and began measuring something. Max didn't interfere. He didn't confront. He let them do what they came to do, then returned to the Suzuki he was rebuilding, though his hands trembled slightly as he fitted the new throttle cable. It was the feeling of someone walking across your roof while you sat below in silence, the sense of being measured for removal. By the end of the week, 2 of Max's customers canceled appointments, citing a change in community traffic policy and concerns about new road limitations. One of them, a local contractor, apologized profusely and explained that he'd been warned unofficially that any vehicles parked in Max's driveway for more than an hour would be reported as commercial encroachments. Another neighbor, a single mother Max had helped with her alternator for free, crossed the street when she saw him walking to his mailbox and pretended to be on her phone. The social isolation was beginning to take hold, subtle and corrosive. It wasn't that they hated him. They feared becoming his ally. Max understood it. He didn't blame them. Fear had a way of turning people into ghosts. One night around 2 a.m., Max's perimeter alarm tripped. He rose instantly, fully clothed, grabbed his flashlight and stepped out the back door without hesitation. There was no sound, just the click of the gate slowly closing as if someone had slipped through moments earlier. He swept the area with his beam and caught the faint glint of something near the far edge of the fence. A gloved handprint smeared across the dust-coated window of his shed. Nothing taken. Nothing broken. Just a message. Max reinforced the fence the next morning, doubled the strength of his locks, and added a secondary camera with infrared capability. Record only, low res, but enough to track motion. He uploaded the footage to a remote server he'd set up after the second incident. If they wanted to play shadows, he could play shadow chess right back. But the real turning point came when Max's permit for the upcoming garage roof repair was denied. The reason given: pending zoning conflict. Despite the fact that the permit had been preliminarily approved weeks prior and the materials already ordered, the project was halted indefinitely. Max's lawyer traced the decision back to an anonymous complaint filed through the city's online portal. Someone was using the city's systems to stall him, to tie him down with red tape until frustration made him give up or make a mistake. That was the strategy. Wear him out. Force him to slip. Instead, Max adjusted. He called in an old contact, Walt, a retired mechanic with military roots and no tolerance for bureaucratic games. Walt had done private security consulting in the past and knew how to spot subtle intimidation tactics. He spent a full day walking the property, noting camera blind spots, street line angles, and weak fence areas. "You're being caged in," he said plainly, "but not legally. It's a behavioral strategy. They're escalating pressure and waiting for you to snap." Max didn't argue. He'd felt it in his bones for weeks. He and Walt spent the next 2 days reinforcing the property. Nothing aggressive, nothing illegal, but everything very deliberate. The perimeter now had sensors at every gate. Walt set up a live log sheet, tracking each incident with timestamps and photos. Max stored it all in encrypted backups and multiple printed copies. They were building a case, quietly, methodically. If it came to court, it wouldn't be Max's word against theirs. It would be evidence against speculation. Yet even as he built his defense, Max knew something else was needed. A message. A controlled disruption. Something legal, but loud. Something that reminded them that he was still here, still standing, and that pushing harder would only bring the sound of engines roaring to life. Not because he wanted war, but because they started it, and he was done sitting idle. The plan began to form slowly, like an engine warming under the hood. 5 bikes, simultaneous ignition, focused timing. But it wasn't just about smoke and noise, it was about drawing the line, and letting them know he was done being polite. Max had spent most of his life solving problems with logic, patience, and a deep understanding of how things worked, and he had long since learned that sometimes the best way to fight chaos was not with rage, but with structure. So, when the pressure reached a new peak, when the fine for non-compliance was officially activated and his Daily Mail began arriving with threats printed on city letterhead, Max didn't lash out. He sat down and restructured his entire defense. He sorted the incident logs Walt had collected, cross-referenced every violation notice with original codebooks, and began charting connections between names on the complaints and the committee. It wasn't about proving innocence anymore. It was about proving intent. One evening, Walt knocked on his door carrying 2 brown folders and a laptop. He'd been doing his own digging, calling in favors from a few friends in real estate and construction. What he found wasn't explosive, but it was enough to change the tempo. The wife of one committee member was listed as a silent partner in a local contracting company that specialized in property acquisition and renovation. The same company had been involved in multiple buyouts in neighborhoods where residents were pushed out over compliance issues before their homes were flipped and sold at massive profit. Max stared at the document, the name highlighted, the signature line clear. "They're trying to drive you out so they can flip the lot," Walt said. "Probably build a guest house or something trendy, market it as vintage with a workshop option. Your garage is in their way." It made sense. Not just the harassment, but the pacing, the strategic timing of notices, the calls, the sudden presence of surveyors and interim injunctions. It wasn't personal. It was predatory. They didn't want his garage because it was ugly. They wanted his land because it was valuable. With this knowledge, Max's focus sharpened. He instructed his lawyer to file a Freedom of Information request to obtain records of all committee meetings in which his property was discussed. While the lawyer warned it could take time, the request itself was enough to signal that Max wasn't backing down. At the same time, Max decided to strike not in court, but on his own terms. On a warm Friday afternoon, the same day the neighborhood was hosting a seasonal Community Unity event around the main pool, Max rolled out 5 of his oldest and loudest machines. They weren't just bikes, they were relics. Each had been rebuilt over years, some using parts nearly impossible to find, all of them technically legal but barely, each with an exhaust note that could be heard across a county line. Walt helped prep the site, laying down fireproof mats and marking off space so Max wouldn't violate noise limits at night. Then, as the first glasses of white wine were poured and the sound of shallow music drifted from the poolside speakers, Max started one engine. The Revved sliced through the warm air like a blade. Seconds later, the second bike roared to life, then the third, then 4th and 5th, each staggered for maximum impact, the sound building in layers until it felt like the air itself was vibrating. Smoke poured from 2-stroke exhausts and hovered above the street like fog, not thick enough to be dangerous, but dense enough to turn a summer evening into a memory people would smell for weeks. From the edge of his driveway, Max watched as the pool party dissolved. Some shouted, others rushed to pull kids from the water, and several ran toward the clubhouse yelling about citations and police. Max said nothing. He wore ear protection, had legal sound decibel permits displayed on laminated posters, and kept the engines running just under the legal limit for continuous noise emission. Walt walked over with a clipboard showing their compliance. When 2 members of the council approached yelling about malicious intent and aggressive harassment, Max calmly handed them the documents. "I'm within every limit," he said. "I checked twice. Would you like to call the city to confirm, or shall I?" The woman, an interior designer who had recently bragged about curating the vibe of the neighborhood, threatened to report him to the police anyway. "Do what you need to do," Max replied. "But be sure to tell them that I filed my notice of demonstration in advance. This isn't a protest. It's an engine test." The police did come. 2 officers. They walked up slowly, visibly annoyed more by being called out than by what was happening. Max had spoken to one of them before, years back during a call about vandalism near his back gate, and he greeted them with respect. The officers checked his documentation, verified his permits, made a few notes, and eventually walked away, telling the committee representatives to handle their disputes through the city, not through noise complaints. The moment they left, Max shut the engines down one by one, each cough of an engine falling silent like a gavel striking wood. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. The crowd at the pool was gone. The music had stopped. The air still smelled of oil and power. That night, Walt lit a small fire in the pit behind the garage, and the 2 of them sat in silence for a long while, the flames cracking gently in the stillness. Max didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just stared into the fire like he always did when a plan worked, but a storm hadn't passed. "They'll come back harder now," Walt said finally. "Yeah," Max nodded. "But now they know I don't scare easy, and next time they'll have to work a whole lot harder to prove I'm the problem." The difference was simple. Before, Max had been defending his home. Now he was building the case to destroy their game, one permit at a time. The silence that followed Max's display didn't last long. Within 72 hours, retaliation arrived. Not with sound or smoke, but with paper. A thick envelope, hand-delivered, not by mail or courier, but by a well-dressed woman who identified herself only as a compliance coordinator for the Community Review Board, landed on his workbench one cloudy Tuesday morning. She didn't come alone. Behind her stood 2 men in matching windbreakers, wearing visitor badges from a private mediation firm Max had never heard of. She was polite, calm, even, but everything about her presence rang like a silent alarm. She placed the packet down, smiled the way politicians smile when they're telling you you've lost, and left without waiting for questions. The envelope contained what they were calling a comprehensive enforcement review, compiled after Max's so-called engine test, citing a violation of the community's collective safety expectations, a phrase Max had never seen in any official code book. But this wasn't just about sound anymore. Inside were statements, alleged witness testimonies, a psychological profile someone had tried to piece together from public records, and even a report suggesting Max's behavior was escalatory, retaliatory, and potentially volatile. One document claimed a neighbor's child had suffered respiratory distress due to exhaust fumes, though no medical report was attached. Another accused Max of willful community destabilization. They were building a different kind of case now, not legal, but moral. They wanted to paint him as unfit, dangerous, unstable. What unnerved Max more than the content was the detail. There were photographs taken from angles that could only have come from his neighbor's second-story windows, notes on his work schedule, deliveries, and when certain customers arrived. Someone was documenting his life with precision. Walt reviewed the folder with him and pointed to one page in particular, an annotated schedule cross-referencing his garage activity with community events. "They're not just reacting," he said. "They're running a coordinated pressure op." That night, Max walked the perimeter of his lot for hours, flashlight in hand, checking every blind spot, every motion sensor, every piece of wiring. He felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Not fear, exactly, but the cold clarity that comes before war. By Friday, his mailbox contained a summons, The community board was initiating a formal arbitration process. Max was being accused of violating the Residential Harmony Clause, a vague statement in the original development charter that had rarely been invoked and never successfully enforced. It wasn't a law, but it gave them grounds to push a binding mediation. If he refused, they'd escalate to municipal complaint. Max understood the move. They couldn't beat him through zoning or safety, so now they were going to try character assassination, then financial exhaustion. Walt suggested ignoring it, call their bluff, but Max refused. He'd built his reputation on one principle: never run from the fight you didn't start. He appeared at the arbitration. It was held in a rented office suite in a nearby business park, neutral territory by design. The room had fake plants, a water cooler, and 6 chairs arranged in a loop. Across from Max sat 3 committee members, all of whom had publicly expressed concerns about his property. A mediator from the firm, young, overdressed, and visibly uncomfortable, opened with polite formalities. Max listened. Then he laid out his own binder, filled with dated photos, permits, emails, sworn statements, a notarized copy of his original zoning exception, and a statement from a mechanical safety inspector verifying that none of his equipment presented any public danger. Then he passed out copies to each person in the room. "This isn't about safety," he said. "This is about power. You want my land, and you think if you throw enough smoke I'll give up. But you don't know how long I can breathe in smoke." The mediator tried to intervene with conciliatory language, but Max cut him off. "This meeting isn't about compromise. It's about making a record, and this is mine." When it was over, the board looked shaken, but not defeated. They were going to escalate again. Max could see it in their eyes. The question was how. It came sooner than expected. The following Monday, Walt found a city utilities van parked near the rear easement of Max's property. No one had contacted him about service work, and the city had no open tickets. When questioned, the 2 workers gave vague answers about routine access checks before leaving. That evening, Max discovered that the conduit box supplying power to his workshop had been opened. Nothing stolen, just unlatched. A warning. Max filed a report with the city, but he didn't expect results. He instead installed a lock with an internal tamper sensor wired to his shop alarm. The next day, someone submitted an anonymous tip to the fire department alleging flammable storage and unpermitted chemical usage on Max's lot. 2 fire marshals showed up unannounced with clipboards. Max let them in, calm and transparent. They left with nothing. No fines, no violations. But one of them admitted, under breath, "We've had 3 calls about you this month, all anonymous. They're trying to break you." Max responded by fortifying his routine. He stopped working after 8 p.m., installed blinds on every shop window, switched to battery-powered lighting for the rear lot, and started logging every approach to his fence line using a motion-activated camera grid. He also filed a cease and desist through his lawyer, citing harassment and abuse of administrative process. The board didn't respond, but the tone shifted. Flyers began appearing on doors in the neighborhood. Unsigned, passive-aggressive circulars about preserving peace, reducing visual clutter, and encouraging retirement of legacy structures. One had a photo of Max's garage at sunset, cropped and darkened to look almost ominous. He found one tucked under his windshield, another pinned to his back gate. He never saw who delivered them. One evening, Dustin came by again, this time not with a bike, but with a story. He'd overheard his mother on the phone with someone from the board. She was scared, not of Max, but of being next. She didn't want trouble, but they'd implied that if she didn't support their complaint, her own property would be scrutinized. Max thanked the kid, told him to stay out of it, and sent him home. But inside, something clicked. This wasn't just about removing him, it was about compliance. If they could break him, no one else would dare push back. Max made a new plan. No more waiting. No more reaction. He began collecting every instance of false reporting, every fraudulent claim, every unofficial visit. He compiled names, times, license plates. He invested in professional legal counsel, not just his friend, but a firm that specialized in civic abuse and land rights. He hired a private inspector to conduct a full compliance audit of his property, certified and stamped, and posted it in a frame on the exterior wall of his garage. He started preparing a formal grievance to be filed with the State Administrative Board. Quiet, legal, relentless. But Max also knew that sometimes pressure needs a release valve. And as spring turned to summer and the board planned its grand Founders' Day block party, he prepared one more message. Not illegal, not aggressive, just unforgettable. Something that would remind every neighbor, every member of the board, every guest sipping wine behind plastic tablecloths and fairy lights that Max Jarrett was still here, still building, still unbroken, and still loud enough to shake the bones of anyone who thought he'd ever fold. The Founders' Day block party was the kind of event designed to sedate a neighborhood. Streamers hung across light poles, children bounced in inflatable castles rented by parents trying to prove stability, and every table overflowed with potluck offerings bearing handwritten labels. The wine flowed early and the music was piped in through rented speakers disguised as planters. The board had pulled out all the stops this year, trying to recapture a sense of community they themselves had been dismantling piece by piece, one notice and anonymous report at a time. Max hadn't been invited, of course, not officially, but his mailbox did contain a courtesy flyer, folded in half and shoved deep behind the rest of his mail like even the paper didn't want to be seen with it. He pinned it to his corkboard without comment. This time, he wouldn't need revving engines or billowing smoke. His response would be quieter, more final, and built on a structure they couldn't easily deny. It began earlier that week, when Max and his new attorney, a sharp, gray-suited woman named Keller who specialized in zoning and municipal retaliation cases, filed a formal motion with the county commission. It wasn't just a complaint. It was a motion to censure and investigate the neighborhood board for targeted harassment, abuse of process, and conspiracy to forcibly devalue and acquire private property. Accompanying it was a detailed file containing audio recordings, photographs, notarized affidavits, and, most damning of all, a transcript from a recent meeting in which one board member openly discussed pressuring that old mechanic out before fall. The transcript had been legally obtained by a concerned neighbor who'd finally had enough. Max didn't know who it was. The files came in an unmarked envelope, but the timing was perfect. Keller submitted everything to the county ethics committee, and from there, to the local press. So while the board raised toasts and passed around polite gossip near the fire pit by the pool, a county representative was already reviewing the submitted evidence, and a reporter from a mid-tier investigative news outlet had begun making calls. Max didn't plan on making a scene that night, but he made sure they noticed when he pulled his truck out around sunset. Clean for once, the county tag plate on the dash visible through the windshield. He drove past slowly, nodding to anyone who had the guts to meet his eye. Not many did. The real explosion came Monday morning, when the city clerk's office received a formal summons to produce documents related to all enforcement actions taken against Max's address. The request included metadata, meeting minutes, vote tallies, and authorization protocols. That same afternoon, 2 county investigators showed up to question members of the board. The HOA president, an ex-realtor with a habit of using buzzwords like synergy and rebranding, was caught off guard and quickly lawyered up. But the damage had already begun to spread. A copy of Max's complaint leaked to a Community Watch forum. Comments began to appear, quietly at first, then louder. One user recounted being pressured to sign a petition without being shown the full wording. Another admitted they'd been told not to associate with Max if they didn't want problems. Someone posted a photo of Max helping a neighbor fix a flat tire in the rain with the caption, "This guy's the problem?" Suddenly, the narrative shifted. The board, once untouchable in their self-appointed authority, now scrambled to contain a situation they couldn't control. At an emergency meeting called without notice, several members suggested suspending further action against Max until clarity could be reached. But it was too late for clarity. Max's legal team had filed a cease and desist against 3 individuals for defamation and unlawful interference with personal business operations. A letter from Keller reminded the board that continued attempts to hinder lawful work activity could result in civil liability, damages, and a formal injunction. What Max hadn't expected, what shook him more than he'd like to admit, was the slow trickle of quiet apologies that began arriving. A handwritten note left on his gate. A knock at his door from a man who once threatened to report him for code violations, now mumbling something about being put in a hard spot. Even Dustin's mother came by one morning, eyes down, holding a pie she said was just for the holidays. Though it was early July, Max didn't gloat. He didn't even reply to most of them. He just nodded, accepted what he could, and filed everything else away with the same precision he used on carburetors and torque specs. But the biggest shift came from the city. The County Ethics Board formally launched a review of the HOA's enforcement practices, citing alleged patterns of targeted suppression and inconsistent application of community standards. That language, cold, bureaucratic, impossible to ignore, hit harder than any engine noise ever could, and with it came restrictions. The board was instructed to suspend all pending enforcement actions until the investigation was complete. All fines were frozen, all complaints tabled. For the first time in months, Max woke up without a new notice in his mailbox. He spent that day doing something he hadn't done in a long while, working on a project not for money, but for himself. A vintage Norton Commando that had sat untouched in the corner of his garage for years. He stripped it to the frame, cleaned the rust with care, and as the sun began to set over a street that was finally quiet on his terms, he thought not of revenge or victory, but of air filters and paint colors. The battle hadn't ended. It had simply changed shape. But for the first time, Max wasn't just reacting. He wasn't cornered. He had ground under his boots, a team behind him, and the attention of a system that finally realized he wasn't the nuisance. He was the warning. By the time summer began to slip into its last humid stretch, the street had changed. Not in structure, no new houses went up, no fences came down, but in air, in energy. The invisible tension that had wrapped itself around Max's property like wire had started to fray. It was in the way people looked at him now, not with suspicion, not with fear, but with something closer to recognition, like maybe finally they saw the man instead of the myth the board had tried to craft. Keller kept him informed of the ongoing ethics review. It was slow, as all bureaucratic wheels are, but steady. Evidence was now officially logged, interviews were underway, and subpoenas had been issued. The board's internal emails were under audit, and from what little had already leaked, it was clear their confidence had been built on assumption rather than legality. One of the most vocal members had already resigned, citing stress and misinformation. Another, the same man who had stood outside Max's garage months ago claiming concern for aesthetic alignment, had quietly listed his house for sale and left town. No press release. No farewell. Max didn't celebrate. He didn't throw a party or rev engines in triumph. Instead, he simply returned to work. Steady, calm, uninterrupted. His garage reopened fully, no longer operating in defensive posture. Customers began to return, some old faces, some new. One man said he'd heard about the whole mess from a cousin 3 towns over and came just to shake Max's hand. Another brought a busted Harley and asked if Max could make it run like it used to when I still had hair. Max fixed both the bike and, for a moment, the man's shoulders. Even Walt, who had been staying close throughout, finally took a weekend off, leaving Max with a half-joking warning. Try not to declare war while I'm gone. The biggest change wasn't in Max's garage, it was in the boardroom. The association, under public and legal scrutiny, was forced to conduct an open community forum, this time not in the polished clubhouse but under a rented canopy on the shared lawn with county officials in attendance. Max didn't speak during the meeting. He sat near the back, arms folded, listening as residents aired frustrations they'd been holding in for years. It turned out Max wasn't the only one. A family had been fined for a trampoline visible over a fence. An older woman recalled being forced to repaint her mailbox 3 times for being too vintage. Story after story poured out, like water from pipes too long under pressure. When it was done, Max stood, not to argue, not to accuse, but to hand over one final document to the county liaison. A signed proposal to formally review the charter's enforcement clauses with direct homeowner input and third-party oversight. The crowd applauded. Not for him exactly, but for the shift he'd triggered. In the weeks that followed, Max received a formal letter from the city. The temporary violations lodged against his property were nullified. His zoning grandfather clause was reaffirmed and digitally re-recorded into the public record. The investigation into the board's conduct remained open, but the active harassment campaign had collapsed. His property, once described in legal print as non-conforming, was now deemed historically recognized usage. Max pinned that page to his corkboard beside the engine test permit. He didn't feel like a winner. He felt like a man who'd finally been allowed to breathe his own air again. On the last Friday of August, he invited Dustin over to help finish assembling the Norton. They worked without rush, talking little, just the way Max liked it. When the engine finally turned over and purred instead of coughed, Dustin grinned, wide and real. Max nodded once, then said what he always said when something just worked. There it is. Later that evening, Max sat on the bench outside his garage, coffee in one hand, cigarette in the other, watching the sky shift into that bruised purple before darkness fully claimed it. The neighborhood was quiet. Not forced quiet, not suppressed, but calm. Lived in. Normal. Somewhere down the street, music floated faintly from a backyard speaker. No one called in a complaint. No one walked by, pretending not to see him. For the first time in months, Max didn't feel like a target. He felt like a fixture, and they would never be able to move him again.